Ask anyone learning to program, and they'll probably tell you some of the biggest advice given to learn a new language or framework is that you have to do projects. Now, if you're learning a popular language, there's probably no shortage of different YouTube videos that you can follow along a tutorial and make cool little apps. And those are great. They're an excellent way to get exposure to whatever you're trying to learn. But they do have some pitfalls. You're not going to be able to take what you make and throw it on your portfolio if you were just copying along. Also, when you're just following someone else's code, you're learning something, but you're not getting the full experience, because a big part of coding is running into problems, having to find workarounds and solutions, and you come out of it with a better understanding of whatever it is that you're developing. And that's why I think it's so important to do your own side projects. Not only are you going to be able to put on your portfolio, but also you're just getting the most out of your learning. So in this video, I'm going to talk through the steps of doing your own side project from idea to completion, and I'll be using this little app that I made just the other day as an example for all of those processes. All right, let's get started. During this quarantine, I've had quite a bit of free time, as I presume most people have. And so I thought it would be a good idea to take this as an opportunity to work on my guitar. I've played for a long time, but I've never really committed to some of the things that take a little more time and commitment to learn, like making sure I understand where all of the notes are on the fretboard. And that's something that I've started to work on more. And so I was watching this video about someone talking about how he learned the fretboard, and it was by using a diagram that he looked at every day and then would kind of quiz himself. He said he would pick a random note on a random string and he would have to find that note. And I just found it was way too difficult to try and find random notes and strings, because I ended up using these same patterns and ending up picking the same notes and strings over and over again. And so I thought, well, that's the perfect opportunity just to write a simple little app where I can have it give me a string and a note, and then I have to identify where that note is. And then obviously I thought, well, that's something I could just make, throw a fretboard on with little buttons for each fret, and I can have it quiz me, and when I click it, if it's the right one, it'll be green, and if it's the wrong one, it'll be red, and maybe it identifies the right green one. And so that's what I made. Now, I could have used any framework for this. In my case, I used Java, vanilla JavaScript with SCSS, but nevertheless, I think the process I took to do this is the process that anyone could use for whatever language or framework you're trying to learn. And so before I get started, I just want to say, this isn't going to be a code review. And so if you don't know how to code JavaScript or even code at all, and you're just kind of interested in the field, you can follow along, because I'll just be talking about the general process of doing everything. And hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that regardless of your skill level, you can find simple ideas and turn them into apps and use that as an opportunity to learn. So you've decided to make your app. What do you do? When I first started to code, I was well aware that there are tons of different videos that you can use and tutorials to follow along and build really cool apps. But I was sort of maybe intimidated by the idea of making my own thing. I thought, what if I run into a problem and halfway through I'm just stuck? I can't reverse the video to see what the guy did in the video. But over the years, I've challenged myself more and more on different side projects, and it's always come out as a good learning experience. And so, what are the first steps? Now, what I like to do is I've got this notebook here, and I like grid paper, and I just wrote down some of the ideas and I drew some pictures out, and I started with a brainstorming exercise where I said, this is what I want, and this is maybe the general approach I plan on taking. Maybe draw out some pictures of what you think it should look like. But for the most part, I think it's good for at least 5 to 10, maybe even longer, just free associate some ideas for how the workflow might be, or at least how the flow of the app should be. you can throw out ideas for features that you might not even add in the first iteration, but just that are good to keep in mind so that as you're developing, you know, okay, I might have to expand this later, so I shouldn't just throw it together sloppily. I should create a data structure that can then be accessed to create the next feature that I'm looking at making in the future. Once you've kind of settled on the general idea of what you're going to make, I think it's good to write out what it is you're going to build in the first iteration. And the reason for this is because it's so easy to have scope creep, where you start with this small app, and as you develop, you think, ooh, I could add this on, and I could add that on. And all of that slowly starts to delay the finished version 1 product. And then after a while, you've got a bunch of different things in motion, and you end up just not completing it. And trust me, I understand that fully. And it's because of that I've learned, for myself, I have to write it down, what I'm going to make. And this is also great if you're looking to get a job and want to understand about how you might do things at a company. A lot of times when you're working on a team, especially if you're following Agile Scrum, you're going to create these stories and you're going to add acceptance criteria to those specific features that you're going to work on. And so that's what you should do. Write exactly what you're going to make. And as you're developing, you might say, ooh, I think this would also be a good idea. Okay, do that in V2. But your job, once you get started, is to make what you committed to making. And so once you've gotten everything planned out for what the app should look like, what features it's going to have, and what features may be good in the future, but you don't want to develop yet, you're ready to get everything set up for the development. Now, the first part on the development side of things is figuring out what your development process looks like. And this is obviously going to change a lot based on the language or framework that you're working with. In my case, I decided I wanted a few things. Just a simple build environment where I could save files, reload the page, and the changes would be there. And so what I settled on was I was going to use Yarn for my package manager, utilizing Webpack for all of the bundling. I wanted to use Babel for the JavaScript and SCSS for all of the styling. And it was a relatively simple setup. If you've seen some of my other videos, I talked about how to build a basic build process. And so I just copied that right over. I didn't want to spend too much time on anything. I just wanted to get the app built. Once I made sure that basic styles worked and that I could console log and the JavaScript build was working properly, I could import files, then I knew I was ready to start the development. So again, obviously, this is going to vary completely between different languages and libraries. But nevertheless, I think I'll explain what I built and then just walk through the steps I took to build it out. And so that you can at least see an example of how you might take a large problem, break it down into smaller pieces, and then just knock off one piece at a time. So the mini applet I made was basically just a quiz of the guitar fretboard. It's got a button to press, which will load a new question, or you can just press enter. And when that event's triggered, it basically gives you a string and a note. So it might say on the 5th string, give me a C sharp. Then, on the fretboard below, you have to identify where the C sharp is. You just click on that fret, and if you're right, then it lights up green. And if you're wrong, it shows you where the correct note is on that fretboard. So it's a super simple app, and I didn't want to do anything too complex. For me, it was genuinely about making something that I've been using, and I just wanted to make it work so that I could keep practicing my guitar. So there were a few different problems I needed to solve. First one is I needed something to generate questions. I needed that to coincide with the guitar itself. So if I wanted to set it as a bass guitar, it needed to know what type of guitar it was working with. For that, obviously, I needed some way to have the logic handled for a guitar, and I didn't want to write all of that myself. Fortunately, I was able to find this fretboard NPM library that worked great. Now I also needed then to handle the rendering of both the quiz questions as well as the fretboard, because things were going to get re-rendered. And then I needed to be able to handle the click events, both of the generating the questions, but as well as on the fretboard. What happens when you press a note, whether a question has already been asked and answered, or if a question has been asked and now you don't see if the notes are on the fretboard. Now, what I started with was the fretboard, because I just wanted to make sure that I could build out something that looked good enough that it wasn't annoying to actually interact with. And so what I settled on was, instead of making the whole fretboard and then adding strings and then adding frets and then finding a way to add buttons to each fret, I actually took the opposite approach. I started with one note, the way I viewed it, which was that part of the string, which included the fret. And the idea was that if you stick a bunch of notes from left to right, it makes that part of the fretboard. And so I made sure that the background was the color of the fretboard that I wanted, and the string was there, the fret, and the button was all self-contained. That way, when I render it all, I can just create a loop that basically says for all of the notes on that string, put them in a row, and for all the different strings on the fretboard, make those rows. And so I started first just by making one note. And I was doing this just hard coding the HTML. I didn't need to do any looping. I didn't need to handle the fretboard logic yet. I just wanted to write 3 notes together and then maybe put 2 different rows together so that I had 2 different strings, and I found that it worked. Now, one thing that I had decided on beforehand is that this is just a desktop app. I wasn't going to worry about making it work on mobile, just because I was making it for my specific use case and I knew I didn't need it. So it didn't make sense to go through that unless, say, I wanted to make sure that I was working on my mobile responsive development. And so like I said, it's not something that I needed to work on, so I didn't want to waste too much time on it. So once I had those individual notes working and I knew that I could make a fretboard, I decided it was probably smart to put them into just a little JavaScript template file that I made. And how it works is by just generating the HTML in string literals, where I can add variables, for example, like showing the notes or hiding the notes, or passing in different arguments to the whole template to handle if I'm making the notes green or red and all of that stuff. And so I threw that into a separate file, and I passed in a guitar object, and that held all of the information about the different strings, the different notes, everything. I also passed in an optional object, which has all of the different extra parameters that you want. And so I knew that I would be able to use that once the quizzes were made to be able to handle events and re-render the fretboard to match the new state. And so once I had that, I was able to just create, say, a fretboard that matched whatever state I wanted and just append that into a div with a specific ID. And so I created just this guitar div, which was able to house the fretboard. And whenever anything changed, I was able to use the template file that I made to create a new guitar to match the state that I wanted, and just set the HTML of that div to the new fretboard. Once that was done, I knew that I was ready to create questions. And that was super simple. I, again, just passed in the guitar. And so if I changed to create a different type of guitar, like a bass guitar, then the questions were going to be generated from the specific guitar. And all it did was say, pick a random number to match the array of the different strings. And then on that string, pick a random number that matched which placement of the note on the fretboard. And once you do that, then you can extract what the note is, and you already have what the string is. And so it would just spit out a string and a note. Finally, in the main file, it was as simple as generating the new questions. And the questions that were generated were actually, again, generated and re-rendered from the template file that I created. And what was good about just regenerating the HTML inside of the different divs for the question section and for the fretboard section is I wasn't having to actually worry about tracking the different event listeners, because every time I re-rendered, I knew that the event listeners were going to be cleared, and so I could just add the event listeners that I wanted to whatever was rendered. And so all I really had to do was piece together the new question and event listeners for the actual guitar that I was creating. And that turned out to be one of the easiest parts. Once I actually handled the logic of rendering everything and being able to track what button was being pressed, then it was just as simple as checking, does the note of the button I just pressed coincide with the question, both on the string and the note side of things? And if it does, great. If it doesn't, well, then obviously make sure that it goes red. And that was pretty much it for the development of the app. It didn't take too long, but it was a good refresher for me on making sure I understood vanilla JavaScript, not working with React, no jQuery, just standard event listeners and using template literals to do different rendering, and it was actually pretty fun. The final step with respect to the actual development of your side project is, once everything works, going through all the code again and looking for areas that you could clean things up. Maybe it's comments that you left in there, or just extra bits of code that were maybe sloppily written that you could clean up. And you're basically just making sure if you ever have to revisit the code again, at least while you still understand what's going on, you have the opportunity to make sure that it's readable. Whereas if you come back in 6 months and you haven't cleaned anything up, you might be annoyed at yourself that you didn't just fix some of these things, change those stupid variable names to things that actually match what they're doing or what they are. And also, it's just good practice. We can all get in the habit, once we're in the mud, we just want to make something work, to just do things quicker so that you can get things going. And that's fine, I get it. But nevertheless, go back and make sure that you have some discipline with your code, because you should care about it. If it's your craft, you want to hone it and you want to do the best job you can, and that means working on code quality. And so I think you could call it an optional step, but I think everyone should do it. Now, the next step I want to outline is more optional, but again, I highly recommend doing this. And this is a retrospective period. What you're going to do for this is sit down and write about what you made. You'll not only describe what you made, but you'll also say how it compared to what you initially designed, what you did well, and what you did poorly. Part of that is saying what you would do if you had to do it over again. It allows you to make sure you know what you need to get better at. When you do projects in the future, you'll be more self-aware to know what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and you can then readjust your workflow accordingly. And if you think you did a kick-ass job, you should be proud. You could have sat on your butt and done nothing. And the same thing is true for the other side. Maybe it sucked. Maybe you got halfway through, you just ran into problems and you couldn't finish, and you just know you're done. And that's happened to me. And so what you have to do is write about it and be aware. Maybe you should have thought through the data structures more, or maybe you would have drawn a better diagram of the data flow so you knew what was going on beforehand. Whatever it is, it's good just to acknowledge what you did wrong. Don't kick yourself over it, because you could have done nothing. And what you did was learn. And so that's going to be important when you try something similar in the future. And if you're self-aware enough to know what you did wrong, that'll help prepare you for the future. So, what are my final thoughts? Well, the first thing is, I think unless you're in the habit of having side projects and working on things, you can run into paralysis by analysis when you finally decide, I'm going to do something. It can be really difficult to think of ideas on the spot, and so you may just not do anything. Or maybe you have some ideas, but it just sounds like way too much stuff. For this, I think what's important to do is break everything down. If you have this idea for this really cool app that handles video stuff and maybe some chat and all this different functionality, you don't need to do it all at once. Find the basic building blocks of what you're trying to create and make those your side projects. In that case, you've got a number of different projects that you can work on over the next few months maybe, and it's something that can keep you motivated. And if you don't have an idea, but you are genuinely serious about wanting to do more side projects, I think my biggest advice is to stay vigilant. Make a habit out of questioning whatever you're doing and just say, how could I make something small that would relate to whatever I'm working on? In my case, it was just, I wanted to work on this fretboard practice. And so when I asked myself, is there a simple way I can make an app out of this? The answer was just obviously, yeah. And everyone has different interests. And so I think especially if it comes to making original ideas for whatever that's worth, just let whatever your other interests are influence what you're making. And finally, I can't stress this enough. Side projects are excellent. I think they help you learn whether you're a beginner or you're deep into your career. And so everyone should do it. I think what a good number that I've heard before is everyone should do 2 to 3 side projects a year, at least. Obviously, that's going to vary widely depending on where you are. If you're learning, you should be doing a ton of them, a ton of small ones, all of which are just going to build up your confidence and your abilities. If you're further into your career and the side projects that you're thinking about are either companies or really cool apps that you just know are going to take a long time to work on, obviously, you're not going to be cranking those out every weekend. So, nevertheless, I hope I inspired at least one person to finally commit to making that side project that they've been avoiding for a while. Now, if you guys did find this video useful, feel free to drop a like or subscribe for more content like this. Also, and I hate when people do this, where they disguise asking for comments by just asking the dumbest of questions, but it apparently works. And so, if you guys have a cool idea for a side project, put it in the comments below. Otherwise, guys, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.